In this video, I'm going to show you how your words and your thoughts affect your mental health and why this is so important for your overall well-being. Hi and welcome back to Mental Health Power. So once I learned this specific thing, that your words and thoughts have a much more drastic impact on our mental health than most people I think realize, this completely changed the way I approached my journey of recovery from the various mental health issues I had. So you'll see from my previous videos, I do touch on this topic of how thoughts affect people who already have mental health issues. But in this video, I want to show you how it's not just thoughts, but words that are spoken to you and words that you speak yourself, in addition to your thoughts, that affect people who wouldn't ordinarily see themselves as having mental health issues. So I'm really showing how, generally speaking, your thoughts and words affect everyone's mental health. So this is something that I think has not been really widely accepted, and it's the way that we view and perceive thoughts. So the way I see it, and this completely changed my approach to mental health, ultimately, thoughts are actually things. And when I say things, I don't mean that it's an actual tangible thing that you can experience right here in physical reality. What I mean is, if we start treating our thoughts with a high level of importance, so if we treat it in the same way we would a physical object, this changes our relationship to our thoughts. So what I mean is, if we consider, for example, our physical diets, so we consider and we place importance on the things that we consume into our bodies, because we know what we consume into our bodies will have an effect on our physical health. And in that same way, if we treat our thoughts as actual things, so as actually having an effect on us, then we will see that there also exists such a thing as a mental diet, which is very similar in some ways to our physical diet. So if you consider in the same way that, let's say somebody has just a generally not a great diet, so they're eating, let's say, lots of junk food most of the time, and they don't really think about how that's affecting their body, there will eventually be a negative effect on their body. I think that's pretty much 100% scientifically proven and is pretty widely accepted. So you put bad quality food in, and then your physical body, which will use that nutrition, will use those resources to create the body as best as it can. So you have low quality food in, and then your body will also reflect that. So you'll start to have health problems eventually. This same idea does apply also to our mental diet too. So it applies to our minds as well in a very similar way. So if you keep feeding your mind with what we can call low quality thoughts or negative thoughts, that will impact the way that your mind works and how you perceive things. And I also think it's widely accepted that we understand that being able to think clearly is something that will impact our lives. But it goes much, much deeper than that, and I'm going to show you exactly how. So this is something I touched upon on my videos related to the root causes of depression and anxiety, but I need to cover this again. So our mind is split into two main parts, the conscious mind and the subconscious mind. So this is a very brief and very generalized explanation. The conscious mind is what we use when we have to manually and actively think about things. It's also what we can readily experience in our awareness. So when we're calculating things, making decisions, that's all happening in our conscious mind. The subconscious mind is the exact opposite and actually makes up anywhere between 90 to 95% of our mind. That is, this is what supposedly is the number, the percentage. The subconscious mind is essentially the automatic mind. So anything that we don't have to actively think about, the subconscious mind is running that. So When we're not thinking about our breathing, that's being run by the subconscious mind. Our heart beating, the blood pumping around our body, all of our habits, anything we don't have to really think about and it happens automatically, that's being controlled by the subconscious mind. But it's not just our physical habits or our physical actions. Our mental actions as well are controlled by the subconscious. So I explained in the previous videos that the more we repeat an action, whether it's physical or mental, gradually it becomes a habit and goes into the subconscious mind. So this is generally accepted when it comes to, let's say, learning to, let's say, ride a bike or learning a language. The more we do it, the better we get, because gradually through the repetition, it's going into our subconscious mind, and the brain will create neural pathways for that, so that it's easier each and every time we do it, until we don't even have to think about it and it becomes automatic. But what I also think is not largely known or accepted, but equally as important, is that our mental actions also work in the same way. So the thoughts we think over and over and over again, or let's say the things that we visualize as well over and over and over again, because these are still thoughts of some kind, through the repetition of these things or the way we talk to ourselves, that becomes automatic until it goes into the subconscious mind and it runs automatically like a program. Why this is important is in the same way that your physical diet, so if you ate a good physical diet, so ate good food, you'll generally feel better. And if you ate a bad physical diet, you'll generally not feel good. So on one level, you're physically not feeling good, so you may feel actually sick, for example, or you may feel, if you're eating a good diet, that you may feel overall sense of well-being and being full of energy. The other level is that will also affect your emotions. Which makes sense, of course, we've all experienced that. If we eat something that our body doesn't agree with, we feel sick, but we also feel the emotional component to that. And if we eat something that we really like, tastes good, and our body enjoys because it's good for it, then we generally have positive emotions. This also is how our mental diets work, but it's much more subtle, and the impact isn't always felt straight away. It's more of a gradual thing. So somebody who, let's say, feeds themselves, so this is the subconscious, so let's say this is their conscious mind where they create thoughts. And I should point out, I understand that not everyone will recognize this way of thinking, because there are about 5 different ways that people generally think. So the way I'm presenting this is for those who have an internal dialogue, or who can create a dialogue, or those who can create mental images. But I believe this also applies to others who think in ways such as the intuitive feelings or intuitive thinking. But because I believe the majority of people do have, most likely, the majority of people have an inner dialogue, or they can visualize things, I'm going to use that as an example. So let's say this is a thought that someone's generating, and let's say it's negative. So let's put a minus for negative. The more they think this over and over again, that becomes automatic and goes into the subconscious. Now, this will then influence their behavior, because ultimately the subconscious rules habits. But the reason why it actually eventually impacts their behavior is because what is actually gradually changing is their perception. So if somebody keeps thinking, let's say, negatively about themselves, and I covered this in my other video on depression, that is gradually through the process of repetition, which is one of the main features and one of the main mechanisms of the subconscious that works on repetition. Through the repetition of negative thinking or negative self-talk, gradually over time, that is going into the subconscious mind and is altering their perception of themselves and or the world, depending on what that negative thinking is. And so conversely, you can do the exact opposite. you can choose to think more positive thoughts or more helpful thoughts. I understand that this could be misinterpreted as me saying, don't think of anything negative. But ultimately, if you recognize there is, for example, a problem, some people may see that as negative. I'm not saying ignore problems. I'm saying you should be careful with unhelpful and detrimental thoughts. That's how I'm defining a negative thought. Because if you identify a problem and you figure out there is something that needs to be done, I don't see that as being negative. I see that as being positive. So that's what I mean by positive or negative thoughts. So if somebody keeps feeding themselves positive thoughts, that will gradually as well over time affect their perception of themselves or the world or others depending on how they're thinking. And this will affect how they feel. So that shows how in the same way a physical diet will affect how you feel on a physical and emotional level, a mental diet, because it's gradually changing your perception, whether it's in a helpful way or a detrimental way, that is also affecting how you feel. So because it's affecting because your thinking is affecting how you feel, that will ultimately affect your perception and therefore your actions over time. This also means it's not just your thoughts, but the words you speak out loud and the ones that are being spoken to you or the ones you read, because those ultimately go into your mind and they are being absorbed by the subconscious, because the other aspect of the subconscious mind is that it is constantly absorbing. It can only absorb information. So it doesn't know how to stop. It's just constantly absorbing it, which is why we need to be careful with what we absorb. You can imagine then how advertising affects us. And I'm sure we're mostly all aware of how subliminal advertising is a real thing. It does affect us. Even if it's not subliminal, the repetition of advertising or the repetition of music or certain things in the media, like the news, for example, whether it's positive or negative, whether it's helpful or detrimental, that is being absorbed into our subconscious mind unless we are active and we carefully observe what is detrimental, what's helpful for us, and we are aware of how it could affect us. That's the only time where we can minimize the effect of those mental diets, because that does gradually change our perception. Now, I understand that some of this may sound very strange, and I fully accept that I cannot prove this. This isn't something that you can necessarily prove. Yes, there is research on self-talk, and yes, you will find with psychologists and psychiatrists, therapists, generally speaking, yes, it's widely accepted that your self-talk will affect your mental health. But I don't think that to this level of depth that necessarily is widely spoken about, how it actually alters our perception and how a mental diet is just as important as our physical diet, because it affects how we act as well, because it affects our perception. Because I can't prove this, this is something that you can prove to yourself, and you'll find that others who have also learned this and gone through this process, they too have experienced it. And so the proof really comes from your direct experience. And so what I can suggest you consider is how we formed our own idea of ourselves, our self-image, how our own perception of the world and beliefs were formed in the first place. So let's consider our upbringing or a child's upbringing. Everything that a child was told and they experienced influenced their self-image and their personality. So I think it's pretty much accepted that whatever a child is told, they will generally are more likely to believe it, right? And so this also applies to their family, their community. So what the child experiences from family, from community, from the wider society, that will all be absorbed into them and will alter their perception of themselves, which is a self-image, and will create their worldview. And so we can largely sum this up as the influence that society has on them, or their community has on them, or that their parents has on them. And each one will have, of course, differing levels of influence, the parents and family being the main influence. So if we can accept that the words being spoken to a child is going to affect ultimately their personality and their mental health, which this is why childhood trauma is such a massive thing, because it has a drastic impact on the rest of that person's life. Let's also consider that that same mechanism doesn't just stop once we grow up. It still remains. So the words and thoughts that we have still affect us, just not in such a drastic way as it would a child. And so how can we develop a good mental diet that's going to help our mental health? So you firstly want to be observant and learn to observe your own thoughts and the way that you talk to yourself, because we can have sometimes we'll be the kindest people we can to other people, and we can be very understanding with other people, but we can be the exact opposite with ourselves, right? We can be harsh on ourselves. And yet that's not actually going to help us. That's detrimental. So that's an example of what we can call part of a bad mental diet. Because if you're talking to yourself in a harsh way, the subconscious mind cannot differentiate between, it can't really differentiate between what's real and what's fantasy. So in the same way you wouldn't like somebody in real life talking to you in a negative way, why would you accept yourself or a thought talking to you in a negative way? That's going to make you feel bad, and that's ultimately gradually changing your perception of yourself. For example, it lowers your self-worth. And so the first step is to just become aware of the way you talk to yourself, the way that you see the world, and the way that the world talks to you as well. And just to question, how is it impacting your self-image? How is it impacting the way you see yourself? If you notice you have quite a negative perception of yourself and the world, then you definitely want to look at what have you directly been feeding your mind, or what is being fed into your mind without you realizing, like what media influences are there, or the people around you, what kind of things are they saying, what's going into your subconscious mind. And so once you look at what's being fed into your mind, what you want to do is to persist in feeding yourself a positive mental diet. So the words that you speak, remember that when you speak them, it's being absorbed by your subconscious mind. So if you're talking negatively about someone else, your subconscious mind is picking that up, and it is assigning a meaning to that. And this might sound a little strange, and again, I can't prove this. This is something that can be proven to yourself over time. But I'm sure people know, those who talk negatively about other people, it's highly likely that's exactly how they see themselves deep down. And I believe it's because those negative words are being absorbed into the subconscious mind and are being taken in a very literal way, because the subconscious mind, as I said, doesn't necessarily differentiate between what's real and what's fantasy. So while they're talking about someone negatively, the subconscious mind is taking in that negative feeling. That's how I personally view it, but I understand it may seem a little strange. It's just based on my own experiences. And yet people who tend to be very positive towards others, there is a tendency, of course there are exceptions, that they will also generally have a more positive mindset. But of course there can be those exceptions where people think negatively about themselves. So the key thing here is to persist in feeding yourself positive and helpful things. So maybe, for example, you tend to listen to very negative music and you do it repetitively. You can see I'm talking from experience from here. That is going to impact gradually over time the way you see the world and the way you see yourself, depending on the level of negativity. But if you feed yourself something more balanced and more positive, as we know, music affects us on a deep level, but it gradually does impact our subconscious and the way we perceive ourselves. But to get the results, you'll need to be feeding yourself positive, helpful thoughts, and you'll need to be careful as to what you believe others say and what's being absorbed. And you need to persist in this, because since the subconscious mind works on repetition, the repetition will only work if you persist. That's, I guess, the definition of repetition, right? When you keep doing something over and over and over again. And so if you want to see a more in-depth understanding of how this applies to specific mental health issues like depression or anxiety. I did 2 videos where I explain the root causes of those, and this is just one component of those root causes as well. So there you have it. So remember that the words that you speak and the thoughts that you have do have an impact on your mind and your actions and how you feel. So they are incredibly important. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care.